Hello, everyone, and welcome to our March meeting. Please join with me in welcoming Dr. Allyson Sheffield, Professor of Physics at LaGuardia Community College and lecturer at the American Museum of Natural History. Her topic will be Galactic Archeology, with focus on the vital role played by cosmic fossils known as stellar streams in the formation of our very own galaxy, the Milky Way. Please give her a warm welcome.
Great, and can I start sharing screen?
Yes.
Okay, let me just verify that. Perfect. Okay, can you see that okay?
Yeah. Great. Perfect.
Okay, and voice is good?
Yeah. Loud and clear.
Awesome. So thank you for the introduction and thank you all for coming and really for the invitation to speak here tonight. I'm really excited to be doing this. And also you reminded me that I have to solidify my solar eclipse plan. My vague plan is to go to Rochester and I haven't figured out anything with travel yet. So this was a good reminder that I really need to figure that out soon. But so galactic archaeology is the subject that I'll be talking about tonight. And this is the main area of my research. So my job, just a quick, where I'm at. So I am a professor at LaGuardia Community College, and that's part of the CUNY system. So my home base, again, LaGuardia is in Queens, New York. And my job is really split between research and teaching. And the research that I do is in collaboration with some of my colleagues. Some are at the American Museum of Natural History, and I also work a lot at the Center for Computational Astrophysics. That's at the Simons Institute in New York City. So galactic archaeology, I study our home galaxy, which is called the Milky Way, and try to figure out, kind of work backwards. How did the Milky Way get to look the way that it looks today? What is its history? How did it evolve? And I added here to the subtitle, so stellar streams and mergers. So this talk, I'll focus on, what stellar streams are, what mergers are, and what role they played in getting the galaxy, our Milky Way, to look the way that it does today. And this image in the background, this is an artist sketch of what the Milky Way would look like. So there's two galaxies shown here. One is the Milky Way, one is Andromeda, what it would look like when they actually are eventually going to merge together. So getting this idea of mergers into your mind right at the start of the talk. So this is galactic archaeology. I'll show an image here. Some of you might be pretty familiar with it. This is an image showing many, many galaxies. This was taken just about 20 years ago in 2003 by the Hubble Space Telescope. And this is known as the Hubble Ultra Deep Field. So what Hubble did is it stared at a very small patch of sky that was seemingly blank, and it stared for a really long time. So that's why it's called the deep field, ultra deep. So it kept the shutter open on the camera for the equivalent of over 11 days. So that's a lot of light was collected in that time. A lot of photons got in. And this image is the result of that. And in this image, almost everything that you see, with the exception of, I think there's about 5 stars that just happen to be like in the foreground, everything is a galaxy. And there's 10,000 galaxies in this picture, and this is just a tiny smattering on the sky. So this really gives us some perspective just how many galaxies there are in the universe. And I'm going to focus on our Milky Way and another galaxy that is pretty close to our Milky Way, Andromeda. But the sizes and shapes of the galaxies, they're pretty varied as you look in this image. But if you start really looking carefully, there are two main sort of shapes that we see to galaxies in here. So we see some spiral galaxies. There's another spiral over here. And again, if you look carefully, you'll start to pick out some more spirals. And then the other main shape that you see are kind of either spherical or sort of oval shaped galaxies. And those are called ellipticals. So these are the sort of main two types of galaxies that we see. And our Milky Way, our home galaxy, we can't see it in this image because we live inside of it. But we know, so from the best information, the current knowledge that we have to date, that, so this is an artist sketch of what the Milky Way looks like. So this is if we're looking at the Milky Way kind of top down. So this is the central region. It's a spiral galaxy. It's called a barred spiral. This is the bar. And the sun, here we go. So the sun is right about here. So this is the center of the galaxy. It's about 2/3 of the way from the center of the galaxy. And we can look at an image of, so an actual picture of a galaxy that we think looks a lot like the Milky Way. And this is Andromeda. Andromeda is actually the largest neighbor galaxy of the Milky Way. There are some smaller ones. We're going to be hearing a lot about those today. Milky Way's small satellite galaxies, but Andromeda is our largest spiral neighbor. And so a galaxy in general, so whether it is Andromeda or the Milky Way, we can define all galaxies as containing the same essential ingredients. So galaxies are made of stars, gas, and dust, and they're all held together by their mutual gravity. So those are the main building blocks of a galaxy: stars, gas, and dust. And I'm leaving out one important piece, and that's one that we can't see, and that's dark matter. So we can't directly see dark matter, but we can infer its presence based on how it interacts gravitationally with other material. And this is another image taken of the Milky Way. And this was taken by the Gaia mission. So I put the logo for Gaia up here. And we'll hear more about the Gaia mission as we go throughout this talk. We're going to see more data from Gaia. The data was released fairly recently, and there's been a lot of really captivating results. And this is one of them. So this is an image of the Milky Way, and we're looking at it from the inside. And we can see, so we mentioned galaxies are made of stars, gas, and dust. We can see most of the stars are in this band that kind of goes across the center. And so this is the disk part of the galaxy. And there's all of these kind of like smeared looking areas. That's dust. So dust, so this image by Gaia, it was taken with optical light. So that's the light that our eyes can see. And dust will actually absorb optical light. So that makes it a little bit challenging to study some of these regions, especially near the central region. But there's ways to get around that. And one more salient feature I want to note in this image of the Milky Way are these two features. And these are actually small satellite galaxies of the Milky Way. So the Milky Way it's a large spiral galaxy, and it is pulled in smaller galaxies. And again, that's another sort of big piece of this galactic puzzle that we're going to be putting together, these satellite galaxies and the role that they have. So these are just two that the Milky Way has, and actually the Milky Way is not alone. If we quickly go back to this image of Andromeda, you can actually see Andromeda also has some little satellite galaxies that it has pulled in. So this is not something that is unique to the Milky Way. We'll see that this is a process that shapes many galaxies. We think it's a universal process, this merging of galaxies. And just for fun, I showed this. So on the right here, I rotated it. This is that image of the Milky Way that Gaia took. And this on the left, I did not take this image, but if you go to a really dark site, you can actually see the band of the Milky Way, the disk, rising on the sky. So it will actually rise and set over the course of the night. So this was taken in Chile at an incredibly dark site. Again, you're not going to see this from New York City looking like this. You're not going to see it from Westchester either, although you have some darker skies than I do in New York City. But you can travel to a dark enough place. Maybe a lot of you have had the chance to see something as majestic as this, perhaps in the Southern Hemisphere. I have not. So galactic archaeology. So we know the main components of a galaxy. So we said gas and dust and stars and the dark matter, of course. So a galactic archaeologist is looking to answer the question, so how did the Milky Way form? How did it get to look the way that it looks today? How did it evolve? And you can kind of think of, different pieces of the galactic puzzle. So it just kind of showed this zoom in and made it into puzzle pieces. So how do all of these different pieces come together to make the galaxy what we see today? So what were the processes that got us there? In terms of the name Galactic Archeology, so it's a good analogy. So, archaeologists on Earth, so terrestrial archaeology, the main gist is to look for fossils and to study fossils to get an idea, of different ages of fossils and where they formed, where these different species lived. And actually what I'm describing, the minute I said the word fossil, I'm talking about paleontology. So there's, some differences between archaeology and paleontology, but the analogy still holds. So in this picture here, this gets the idea across, if you're using strata of rocks to study, to find fossils, you can get the relative age. So a fossil that's at a top or an upper layer is going to be younger compared to the fossil that's found further down. So that one will be older. And if you find the same fossil or, a relatively similar looking version that might have just aged a little bit differently in two places, so in this case, we find it in Nevada, then we find it again in Oklahoma, this tells you that there's a connection between these species. And for a galactic archaeologist, we use stars as fossils, so those are our equivalents. And stars can tell us, again, how the Milky Way, how did the stars, how did they form? How did they end up in this? We'll see there's a spiral disk of stars moving around the center. There's the halo. How did everything get to look the way that it does? And there's properties of stars. There's actually properties in addition to these three, but I'm going to focus here a lot throughout this talk on these three properties, which are age, chemistry, and motion. So any individual star has an age. It formed at some point. Maybe it formed early in the galaxy's history. Maybe it formed a little bit later. Every star has a unique chemistry. It has a chemical fingerprint. And also stars have motion. They're not excuse me, they're not stationary. They're moving around in the galaxy. And for galactic archaeology, we're really going to be interested in what we call stellar populations. So I'll use this term again as we go through this talk. So stellar populations are groups of stars that formed at the same time from the same gas. So groups of stars that are part of a population, they're all going to have the same age because they all form from the same gas cloud. They're going to retain whatever the chemistry was of that original gas cloud, and they'll have some imprint of their motion as well. So we want to keep this in mind. So we're using stars as fossils, but we're going to be using groups of stars, stellar populations, really as the kind of larger scale cosmic fossils. So going back to the Milky Way and thinking about stellar populations, so in the Milky Way itself, we can start to think about different populations of stars. So earlier when we looked at this image, I pointed out that the vast majority of the stars in the Milky Way, they fall along this main band, this plane here. And that is referred to as the disk component. So that's the disk of the Milky Way. This central region, again, there's a lot of dust blocking it, at least in this picture that was taken with optical light. But this region, the central region, is the bulge. And then surrounding the disk and the bulge is the halo region of the galaxy. And a big difference between the the halo and the disk is first the density of stars. There are far more stars in the disk. The halo is very diffuse in comparison. You have just a few % of all of the stars in the Milky Way in the halo. And another difference, again, we're going to start thinking about populations of stars, groups of stars. So all of the stars that are in the disk of the Milky Way, they all have a similar motion. They're all moving in circular orbits around the center of the galaxy, whereas stars in the halo, they have very different orbits. They're random orbits, they're eccentric, they're not these orderly circular orbits. And I pointed out again here, I said these were going to be really important pieces, these small satellite galaxies that the Milky Way has pulled in. And these are two of the ones that you can just see. You can actually see these with the naked eye if you go down to the southern hemisphere. I said these play a big role in shaping the galaxy. So this is a cartoon version of what we were just looking at. So again, this is the Milky Way, just drawn as a cartoon. And there's a few extras that are shown in this cartoon. So again, the main disk is shown here, kind of as the pink portion. And there's actually two parts to the disk. There's the thin disk, so that's right down the central plane. And then there's the thick disk. So the thick disk surrounds the thin disk. And the big difference is you can think of the thick disk as being puffier. So the stars, they actually come out at a higher height from the central plane than the stars in the thick disk. And that turns out to impact their motion a little bit. So their motion isn't quite as orderly and circular as those stars in the thin disk. And the halo is shown here. The shape of the halo, it's not perfectly spherical. That's actually a big area of study. What shape is the halo? Is it prolate? Is it oblate? But for simplicity, we're just showing it spherically here. And one more addition to this cartoon are something called globular clusters. So globular clusters are these tight groupings of stars, and you can have, 100,000, 10,000 stars in a globular cluster. And I'll point out now, so globular clusters, these are going to be stellar populations. Every star in a globular cluster formed at the same time from the same gas. So eventually we'll be coming back to, okay, how can we take a stellar population like a globular cluster and see what that can tell us about the history of the Milky Way, in the halo in particular. And the halo is also where those satellite galaxies are that we pointed out. And again, age, chemistry, and motion, when we're talking about stellar populations that all formed at the same time, these are the parameters that are kind of conserved throughout a star's life. So how did the galaxy, let's go back here for one more second. So how did it get to look this way? The galaxy was not born looking like this. So we can ask the question, how did the Milky Way originally form, and what sorts of processes happened to create what we have today? And there are two main scenarios for spiral galaxy formation. And the first one is, so this goes back to about 1962, and this is called the rapid collapse model. So the idea here, so there's 4 different panels. So you start with a large cloud of gas and dust, and it originally has some spin to it. And that's what that's indicating here. And the cloud will collapse in on itself due to gravity. So those white arrows that are pointing towards the center, this is showing that the cloud is collapsing, and you're going to get material forming in the central region. And note here in panel 2, there's those globular clusters again. The globular clusters had actually already formed before the cloud collapsed, so they remain out in the halo. And then you eventually get this spinning disk. And the reason you get a spinning disk, as the original cloud is rotating, the material at the equator is actually moving much faster than the material at the poles. So eventually the material, and you can kind of see the arrows here indicating that in panel 3, you're going to get a disk of stars that are rotating around the center of the galaxy. So this actually looks like a pretty decent model. When you look at panel 4 here, and then you go back to this, you see a lot of similarities, but it turns out to not be the entire story. And once we start looking more deeply into the halo, we'll see why this is the case. And I just put a note here. So this is actually the same basic mechanism for how stars will form. Stars will collapse from a spinning ball of gas and dust, and eventually will form, this will become the material that becomes the planets, that becomes the solar system. So that second scenario, and this is thought of as a top-down scenario. So we're starting with all of the material that eventually collapses down. So this is a top-down scenario. And the other scenario is called hierarchical merging. And this is more of a bottom-up scenario. And the idea with hierarchical merging is you start, so this is the current Milky Way today, how it looks. So you start with many, many small galaxies. And over time, those galaxies merge. So if you kind of look at the back row here, you can see that there's many small galaxies. They will start merging with each other, and then some of the galaxies that merge will merge with others, and then eventually these will be pulled in by the Milky Way. And it's really a combination of both. So you have the top down kind of explaining how you get the spinning disk of material, and the hierarchical merging, we'll see that actually explains how you build up the halo with all of these different stars from these smaller satellite galaxies. And the best way to look at this is through what we call a cosmological simulation, which is just a fancy way of saying we can make a movie that is, so all the physics that go into creating the simulation are meant to recreate what a spiral galaxy looks like. So this particular simulation, I'm going to show the simulation running in a moment, but this is just a few screenshots to sort of get you acclimated with what we're going to be looking at. So over here in the top left corner, so this is 13 billion years ago. So that's really when the Milky Way started forming. And then moving over, this is about 12 billion years ago. And then here we're down to about 10 billion years ago. And then this is 4.7. And you can see, so let me start this. The material that you're seeing, the colors are the different things that make up the galaxy. So dark matter is red. Gas, you're starting to see gas now, so that's blue. And eventually, and you can start to see them pretty shortly, stars start forming. So again, material is clumping together, and then you get these filaments, and then material in the filaments is kind of, you can really see that here. This is what becomes the Milky Way. Material in the filaments is coming together. And even at this time, we're at 12.4 billion years. You can see the Milky Way, it has its main spiral structure, but it's still, this is a very violent, messy process. And you have these small galaxies merging with the Milky Way. And very soon, it should start creeping in a moment, there's going to be another large galaxy that merges with the Milky Way. And that should be coming in just a moment. And as this is also, here it comes. So the last major merger. So this is a galaxy, not exactly the same size as the Milky Way, a little bit smaller, but this comes in and merges with the Milky Way. And you can see we're at about 9.6, 9.5 billion years ago. And it's a violent, messy process. You can see there's gas being ejected, new stars are forming when this happens. So as this process goes on, you'll see that the stars from the major merger, they become part of the Milky Way. They get mixed in. And this goes on for quite a bit. Let me fast forward just a little bit. So now we're at 6 billion years, and you can see the structure of the Milky Way. It's pulled in more and more of these satellite galaxies, and that continues to happen. And I'll maybe just go to 3 billion years ago. So things are starting to quiet down. You still have some mergers happening. This is the Milky Way. It's still, some things are being pulled in, but most of the major mergers happened back around 10 billion years ago. Oops, going the other direction. So that is how we believe spiral galaxies like the Milky Way form. So again, you have this initial collapse, that rapid collapse can get you the spinning disk, and then you have hierarchical merging that brings in these other galaxies, some of them larger, some of them smaller. And during that process, we go back, let's say, to this screen grab, you can see there's lots of streams of gas and stars that are created when you have these mergers. So those are stellar streams. And stellar streams are found, so we can see this image on the left here. This is a galaxy called NGC 5907. It's a spiral galaxy. It's actually on its side. So it kind of looks like a cigar here, but it's a spiral. And you can see these tidal streams wrapping all the way around it. And on the right here, so this is another simulation. And this one, so the simulation we just looked at showed many different components coming together. This is a smaller simulation that is just looking at the Milky Way and one satellite galaxy that's getting pulled in. So the blue here is, so this is the disk, and then this is the bulge, and then this spherical object that's kind of yellow at the center, the density of stars. This is meant to be a small satellite galaxy. And actually, specifically, it was this model was meant to be a galaxy called Sagittarius. But we can see the general process. So once you'll see immediately, the satellite galaxy, once it gets pulled in, it's being ripped apart. So the core, you can still kind of see the core, but stars are being ripped off both ahead of and behind the core. And other things are happening. There's torques and twists that are happening to the stream as it's wrapping around. So that's kind of a zoom in on one particular satellite galaxy, that process of tidal disruption. So this is really a nice melding of theory and observations. So theories predict that, again, hierarchical merging for a satellite galaxy, you should have a halo that is filled with these different stellar streams. And on the right, that's exactly what we see. So these are observations of a fairly large swath of sky. And you can actually see this predicted, that network of crisscrossing streams. We see those are observed. That Sagittarius galaxy that was in the simulation we just looked at, we see it here. So there's actually two pieces of it. If you were really paying attention during that little simulation, you noticed that it bifurcated into two pieces. So we know that the predictions of hierarchical merging are correct. We see these. And in fact, we see, so currently, this is a study from just last year, so Mateo 2023, we have just about 100 known stellar streams that are in the Milky Way, primarily in the halo. So this is, sort of a cartoon version of it, but this is the disk of the galaxy that's running right along here. And then this is the halo region. And they're all named. And if you start looking at this list, you notice that there are a bunch of them, I think 12 or 13 total, that begin with the name Gaia. So I said we'd be hearing more about that Gaia mission. So Gaia has already uncovered about a dozen new stellar streams. And, we'll talk about exactly what was done with the Gaia data to find these streams. So streams are everywhere in the halo. And again, showing this in just a slightly different way. So this is not all of those 96 streams that we just looked at back here. So it's a subsample of them. But again, I've showed this to just sort of remind you that these are in the halo and they're kind of dispersed all over the sky. Okay, so let's pause here for a moment before we talk about finding stellar streams. So we have defined what a galaxy is. So the Milky Way is a spiral galaxy. It's made of gas, dust, stars. There's dark matter there too. And we've looked at how the Milky Way formed and the main components got there. So we have the spinning disk, and in the halo, we have material, these satellite galaxies that have been pulled in, and also globular clusters that have been tidally stripped. So we see tidal streams in the halo. So how can we go about finding these? When you look at an image like this, it looks like perhaps these should be easy to find. If you just look on the sky, perhaps with a large enough telescope, maybe you can just find these stars just based on their positions alone. But that turns out not to be the case, and you need to use some clever sort of filtering and knowledge about stars to start to find these streams. And something, I don't think I specifically said it, although it was on the screen here, it's not just satellite galaxies that can be tidally disrupted. So remember those globular clusters that are out in the halo, those can also be tidally disrupted. So globular clusters can also have tidal streams. So globular clusters and satellite galaxies. Okay, so finding stellar streams. We said the fossils that we're using, galactic archaeologists, are stars. And I've already mentioned, so the properties of stars that really don't change over the course of its life. So of course, its age is its age and its chemistry. If we have stars that are born in a globular cluster or a satellite galaxy, they all formed from the same gas. And so they all have the same chemistry to start with. They have the same chemical fingerprint. So in this case, this is a cluster. This is a globular cluster. And you can see there's all different types of stars in here, all different colors. But if they all formed at the same time, then they're all going to have a very similar chemical fingerprint that can identify them. And there are other properties of stars. Stars, they were born with some mass. Stars have a luminosity, temperature, and radius. And luminosity, I just noted that this is power. So this is like the intrinsic power of a star. It's measured in watts, like light bulbs are. So this is, its intrinsic power. It doesn't change with distance. But these properties will, so the luminosity and the temperature, as a star goes through its life, these will change. But we can actually leverage some of these other properties to really get some more information about, how old and where they're at in their life for stars that are in the galaxy. So if we take a star or a group of stars and plot their luminosity as a function of their temperature, we do not get a scatter plot. And again, we're thinking about stellar populations now, groups of stars that formed together, same age and chemistry and motion. So this is, a theoretical diagram. This is called the Hertzsprung-Russell diagram. And we said on the y-axis is luminosity, and then on the x-axis is temperature. And it's not random. And this has been called the most important figure in all of astronomy because it's a stunning, stunning insight into stellar evolution. So a star, depending on where it falls on the Hertzsprung-Russell diagram, this will tell us if it's, in its early stages of its life, and those are stars that fall along this main swath. That's called the main sequence. As a star gets older and starts to sort of enter the, last years of its life, it will become a giant or a supergiant. And then eventually stars will, begin the end of their life and enter sort of the stellar graveyard. And that's where this white dwarf region, that's what that corresponds to. So again, an individual star, depending on where it falls, this tells you how far along it is in its life. So this is really valuable information for sort of piecing together the Milky Way and how all the stars came to be where they all are now. And I'll just point out while we're here, so the main sequence, so any star, the way that a star is generating energy, the power, it comes from the fusion of hydrogen into helium. And all stars will do that. And that's the first stage of a star's life. It will be born, and then depending on its mass, it will appear somewhere on this main sequence. So the sun is here. The sun is happily burning hydrogen. It's about halfway through its life. A star up here on the main sequence, you can see this. So this is temperature, this is luminosity. These are extremely, extremely bright, high temperature stars, and they're blue. These stars run through their fuel. So they exhaust, they take their hydrogen fuel and fuse it really, really, really quickly relative to the sun or even lower. So on the bottom end, the cool red stars on the main sequence, they take up to hundreds of billions of years to burn through all of their hydrogen. Whereas one of these hot blue stars on the main sequence, it can burn through it as quickly as 10 million years. So that's a huge difference. And so if you ever see and we'll look at a HR diagram in just a moment with some Gaia data. We'll see if you ever see stars that are in this region, that's telling you that these are very, very young stars. And again, eventually the sun, once it exhausts all of its fuel, it won't be for 5 billion years or so, it will become a giant star. So again, to sort of, get that point across, depending on where a star falls on this diagram, the HR diagram, we can identify the really young stars that are here. So the sun and stars that are in this general region, they're kind of middle age. And then eventually, once the stars on the main sequence burn through their fuel, they'll become either a giant or a supergiant, depending on where they started here, which is actually dependent on their mass. And then there's the stellar graveyard. So again, let's take a look at this same type of diagram, this HR diagram, but using data from Gaia. So Gaia has come up a few times. It was that image we looked at of the Milky Way to start. That was taken with Gaia data. So this is on the right, a color magnitude diagram made with 4 million stars from Gaia. There's much more than 4 million stars. This was a small sample, that was fairly nearby. So 4 million stars, and you can actually see, so there's those life stages again. There's the main sequence, there's the giant branch, and down here we have the stellar graveyard, the white dwarfs. So we said the Hertzsprung-Russell diagram, the HR diagram, you have luminosity as a function of temperature. But notice luminosity is equivalent directly. So we can, instead of luminosity, we could use a quantity called absolute magnitude. And instead of temperature directly, we can also use so these two quantities that are called from Gaia, so BP and RP color. And in brief, so what Gaia measures a few different things, but in terms of brightnesses, Gaia will look at a star and it'll measure the brightness using sort of different colored filters. So it'll look at a star and then it'll measure how much red light there is for that star. And then it will also measure how much blue light there is. So these two, this color down here, this B is blue and this R is red. So this is all brightness data, which is actually not too difficult to get to measure the brightness of a star. And on the y-axis here, this says magnitude. So we're going to quickly, instead of calling this a HR diagram, we can rename it a color magnitude diagram. And that is, sometimes we think of color magnitude diagrams. I'm an observational astronomer, so I think of the CMD as like an observer's version of the HR diagram. So stellar populations, I keep bringing those up. What if we take this Gaia color magnitude diagram and we start to sort it by different stellar populations? One way to do that, we mentioned earlier that stars in the thin disk move on very orderly circular orbits around the center of the galaxy. And then in the halo, on the other extreme, these stars have very kind of random, what we call eccentric orbits. And then the thick disk is sort of in between. So these three different color magnitude diagrams were made by separating stars by motion. So there's a fairly robust way to pick out stars that are just in the thin disk, just in the thick disk, and just in the halo, using a property called transverse velocity. And the three don't look the same. There's some obvious similarities. You can see the main sequence in all three of these populations. But if we look over at the thin disk, you actually see there's more stars that are up in that hot blue region of the color magnitude diagram. And remember, those were the young stars, those hot blue stars that blow through their fuel in like 10 million years. So they live fast and die hard. You still see these here. So this is telling us in the thin disk, there's still young stars. So new young stars are being formed. The thick disk, you still see a little bit more of the, kind of bluish, maybe not the white blue stars, but you still see a little bit more on the main sequence. But the halo is looking pretty different. So you don't see any of those hot kind of white and blue stars, you only see sort of these cooler stars on the main sequence. And you can see kind of a sharp turnoff where we go from the main sequence to the giant branch. And you also see this feature for the halo that you don't see for the thin or the thick disk. You see it a little bit for the thick disk, but this is called the horizontal branch. And that's a phase once a star becomes a giant, it will go through this phase. So this is indicative of an old stellar population if it's on the horizontal branch. So sticking with color magnitude diagrams, and we've mentioned globular clusters and dwarf galaxies and their stellar streams as these stellar populations. And what we're looking at here, this is still from Gaia. It's just different colors are being used. So this is a color magnitude diagram. I guess it's a little bit cut off here, but it's the same colors that we were looking at in the previous one. And then this is the absolute magnitude on the y-axis. So these are globular clusters, the different colored. I think there's 6 total here. So each color is a different globular cluster. And so each is a separate stellar population. And the globular clusters that are shown here, this looks a lot like the halo color magnitude diagram that we were just looking at. And we said that globular clusters are old and found in the halo. So this is all consistent. We see that horizontal branch. And for these globular clusters, there's about 150 globular clusters known in the Milky Way, and most of them are very old. So in this case, the 6 clusters that are shown here, they're all the same age. I believe they're all possibly 13 billion years old. The only difference, so there's the red sequence here for one of the globular clusters, and then there's the blue sequence. The difference is that they shift a little bit to the right in terms of this point. So this point specifically, remember the color magnitude diagram, this region down here are the main sequence stars. And we don't see any young stars. They've all already evolved off the main sequence. They've become supergiants. They're gone. They're dead. So this turnoff point is actually the same if you have the same age. And the only difference here is these, so the red, the green, they have different chemical profiles. So again, you can start to see this shape for all of these clusters is, it looks quite familiar, and it also looks identical for all of these clusters of the same age. So we're going to see again stellar populations, stars in clusters, or satellite galaxies, those streams. If we look at a color magnitude diagram, we are looking at a snapshot of stellar evolution in that cluster. These are really old globular clusters. Mainly, there's just old stars that are still on the main sequence. Most stars have already burned through their fuel and they're giants now. And this is actually, so when we went back to the sort of theoretical version of the HR diagram, this is actually just that bottom region. So I just zoomed in on that just to kind of point out that this same shape is the same shape that you see here. So this is the bottom of the main sequence. This is the sun here, and then this is the giant branch. So once the sun in 5 billion years exhausts its fuel, its luminosity would increase, its temperature will decrease a little, and it will be a giant star. So this shape, we can actually make a version of this shape called an isochrone. So this is a theoretical isochrone. And the name isochrone, if we just break it down, so iso means same, and chrone, so chrone, that's for age. So isochrones have, again, these same 2 properties that I've been bringing up. They have the same age and the same chemistry. So a stellar population, like we said, a group of stars in a globular cluster or a satellite galaxy, these are stellar populations that have the same age and the same chemistry. So you can start to see how these theoretical isochrones can help you look for stellar populations in a color magnitude diagram. And on the right here, this is, so these are theoretical. This is from a theory paper, and this is showing you different isochrones for different age populations. So again, this is the color magnitude diagram. So the hot blue stars, the ones that live fast and die hard, they are up in the upper left. And then down here, these are the cool red stars that take hundreds of billions of years to burn through their fuel. But the important kind of takeaway here, so this isochrone that I showed on the left here, this is for a really old population. So it actually looks pretty similar to the, the red one that's here. And that's for 10,000, so 10,000 million years is the same as 10 billion years. So that's why that looks so similar. But if you go to younger and younger populations, the shape of the isochrone changes. So for a stellar population, depending on its age, you can find an isochrone and match it, and that will tell you something about the age and the chemistry of that stellar population. So this is a really powerful technique for, again, identifying stellar populations. You can get their age and a handle on their chemistry, and you can find stellar streams this way. So this is just a reminder. So again, I said I was going to be mentioning these throughout the talk. So if you have a group of stars, such as those in a stellar stream, formed at the same time from the same gas, they'll have that imprint. They have the imprint of the age, they have their chemical fingerprints. And we can actually use the color magnitude diagram and isochrone technique to find new stellar streams. So this is a figure from a study in 2018. So this is pretty recent. And what we're looking at are 4 different color magnitude diagrams. And you notice that you can see the isochrone for each of them. These are 4 different stellar streams that were identified in this study. And they have different ages. So isochrone fitting, let me actually show. There we go. This is part of the abstract for this study. So the scientists who did this study, we searched for stellar streams using, they say, matched filter in color magnitude space. So again, color is here, proxy for temperature. This is the magnitude. And they constructed synthetic isochrone. So there's that isochrone of an old metal poor stellar population. And then they did isochrone fitting. And this is what was found. So you can look for groups of stars on the sky. You can identify, you can filter stars in any particular way that you want. You can filter them by motion if you want to get out the different, the disk and the halo. So in this case, this group, they looked for densities of stars on the sky. And when they found those, they would kind of move this window around and then start doing isochrone fitting. And it worked. There was 11 new streams that they found doing this. So these are 4 of them. And there's even information just looking at these 4 color magnitude diagrams. Again, based on the isochrone that you fit, you can specify an age and you can specify a metallicity. So we get the different ages for these 4 stellar streams. And also you can tell something immediately about distance. So the y-axis, this is the brightness. And because all of these streams are at the same distance, they formed from the same satellite galaxies, you can actually infer something about their distances. So for Chenab, you notice the main sequence turnoff point is down at a very, very, very faint, this number. The larger the number, the fainter the stars. So just from looking at this, I can tell you that Chenab, the stellar stream, is the furthest. And then next up is Ravi, because its main sequence turnoff point is higher. Indus is closer. And then the closest of the 4 that are shown here is this Jhelum stream. So there's an immense amount of information that you can get about these populations of stars. You can get their chemistry, you can get their age, you can even sometimes back out their distance. So this is a really powerful technique. So one more, the kind of last topic I want to talk about are mergers of galaxies. We've seen that they play a major role in shaping the galaxy. So what if you have a merger that happened so long ago that all of the stars have already mixed in? So again, if you have these tidal streams, over time, eventually, all of the stream stars, they'll eventually just get mixed in with the galaxy. They won't be in the shape of a stream anymore. And that's if you had a merger that was, a very, very ancient merger. And it turns out, so when we were watching that simulation for the hierarchical merging of the galaxy's halo, we saw that there were small, other small galaxies that the Milky Way was pulling in. And at some point, around 10 billion years ago, it was marked as the last major merger. And that's what we're looking at on the screen here. This is all, artist sketches of that major merger 10 billion years ago. So this is showing, so this was very early in the formation of the Milky Way. So we still had the very sort of pristine Milky Way, not many stars had formed at this point. And then the galaxy that merged with the Milky Way, that's the one that's shown here. And it's called the Gaia Enceladus, and it actually doesn't say it here, but Gaia Enceladus Sausage Galaxy. So the Gaia Enceladus Sausage Galaxy merged with the Milky Way. So this is sort of what it looked like 10 billion years ago. And then you have the present day Milky Way with the stars from Gaia Enceladus Sausage Galaxy mixed in. They're not in tidal streams anymore. Enough time has gone by that even the stars in the tidal streams have started to sort of disperse. They've blurred. So you can't just see the thin stream on the sky anymore. So how can you find these? And where we've been going with color magnitude diagrams, that's actually a way that you can do this. So why is this called the sausage? I'm sure you're wondering. So the detection of the Gaia Enceladus Sausage merger stars, this came in 2018, and it was a study that used Gaia stars. That's where the Gaia comes from in the Gaia Enceladus Sausage, the name. So the sausage part of it, if you take these stars, these 7 million stars in Gaia, and you look at their motions, so there's circular motion, plotted as a function of radial motion. So stars in the disk occupy a nice tight region in this velocity space. It's not unexpected. This is circular motion. We said stars in the disk move in nice circular orbits around the center of the galaxy. But then there's this other group of stars, this significant grouping of stars. And this turns out to be the remnants from that merger. But the name sausage is literally just the shape, the authors of this paper thought that it looked like a sausage. So that's where that moniker comes from. So how can we identify? So can we also use this isochrone fitting technique that we've been talking about to find stars from the Gaia Enceladus sausage merger? So going back, this is the Gaia CMD, the color magnitude diagram for the halo. And you might have noticed this before. I didn't point it out, but there's actually two sequences that you see. You see, this main sequence over, it's, slightly shifted to the left, and you see the turnoff point, you see the giant branch, then you see another one that's shifted a little bit to the right. And it turns out, so I just zoomed in literally. So what I had here, I zoomed on this region so that it would match up with this figure here. So it turns out these two distinct sequences in the halo, the one that's, slightly more to the left, that turns out to actually be stars from the Gaia Enceladus sausage merger. They will actually separate when you look at their magnitude, and so their color and magnitude. And the fact that so these isochrones, this shape looks very familiar now, isochrones for an old population. The fact that there's a shift between the two, they're the same age, but the Gaia Enceladus sausage isochrone it has a different chemistry. That's why they're shifted. So there's a slightly different chemistry for the sausage stars versus the Milky Way's progenitor. And this is a function of the fact that they're different masses. So a different mass galaxy. So the Gaia Enceladus sausage, I think I show it right here. This is smaller than the Milky Way. So there's a slightly different chemical pattern associated with it. So in addition to showing itself the Gaia Enceladus sausage merger remnants, finding them in velocity space, they were also found in this color magnitude diagram from Gaia. And when this was first published, it really wasn't clear exactly what was going on here, what this was associated with. So now we know this is the merger remnants from the Gaia Enceladus sausage merger. So this is, again, an artist sort of idea, sort of extrapolating back to when the merger first happened. So the Gaia main sequence way back then, when stars were literally just starting to form, is going to be shifted just a little bit relative to the Milky Way's progenitor, because the different size means you have different chemistry. And then over time, so, wind the clock forward to present day, and now we have the CMDs that we see, but you still retain that difference in chemical, the chemical profiles from the sausage stars and the stars in the Milky Way's progenitor. This is sort of the distribution of so they're kind of shown as yellow here rather than blue, but these stars are all over the place. So they're mixed in with the Milky Way. And again, they don't have tidal streams anymore. They've been mixed in. So you have to use, kind of clever ways to, find these and disentangle this stellar population. And a kind of nice way to, thinking back to the merging history of the galaxy. So this is a merger tree. And what you're looking at is, so right at the center here is the main progenitor of the Milky Way. So remember it, it formed very early, had some spiral structure to it. And then over time, you have mergers from these different galaxies. So they're the Gaia Enceladus merger. So is shown here, and that happened again around 9 billion years ago. We've talked about Sagittarius also. We still see the tidal streams from Sagittarius. We can even still see the core. It hasn't been completely disrupted, and that was about 6 billion years ago. And just one more interesting thing to notice here, we said that the Milky Way has about 150 globular clusters. But when these satellite galaxies come and merge, get accreted by the Milky Way, they already have their own globular clusters. Remember, when the Milky Way formed, it already had a grouping of old clusters that were in the halo. And the same holds for these galaxies. So a lot of the clusters that are in the Milky Way's halo actually came in, and they are, associated not with the Milky Way, they formed in these other galaxies. So this is really giving us a very insightful way to sort of see how the halo built up over time. And this bar here, the color bar, is by mass. So again, we're looking look back time, so 13 billion years when the galaxy formed. As we're going forward in time, the mass is increasing. Then we have the current mass here. So to wind up, I'll just mention one study that I did recently with some of my students at CUNY. So we looked at one of those new streams that was discovered using isochrone fitting, that 2018 result. And we were looking for new members of this Gelum stellar stream. So we started this project in 2020, and this was still pretty recently after so Gaia Enceladus sausage merger stars had been identified. So in our study, for us to look for new Gelum stars, we actually had to locate the merger debris, which we know how to do now. It has that specific kind of signature in its velocity or in the color magnitude diagram. We had to remove those stars so they wouldn't contaminate our sample. And the way that we did this was using color magnitude diagram. So I'll just kind of quickly step through this. So we started with, this is our very familiar color magnitude diagram now. And the first detection, so our familiar isochrone for an old stellar population. Giants up there, main sequence stars down there. So the Jhelum stream was detected in 2018, and that study, main sequence stars were picked up. So we used that as a starting point to sort of constrain, okay, if we're looking for new members, they need to, and the catalog that we were looking at had giant stars. So here's the main sequence. We need giant stars that are also going to follow along this isochrone. So in 2020, a different study identified 8 giant stars, and they, nicely populate the giant portion of the isochrone here. And then we found a new star. And I should say that we had other possible candidate stars that we thought could be associated with Jhelum, but they didn't fit the color magnitude diagram, so we ruled them out that way. This is a really powerful way of looking for new stellar streams. And again, you can infer a lot of information once you identify the stellar population, its chemistry, and its age. And that gives us an immense amount of information about the different groupings of stars that we find in the halo. So I will highlight a few takeaways here and then take some questions. So we started galactic archaeology. What do galactic archaeologists do? So for a galactic archaeologist, stars are fossils, and stellar streams are even more valuable than a single star. If you have a population of stars, you're able to sort of infer its age, its chemical properties, when it got into the halo, and ancient mergers as well. And the technique that I described for finding stellar streams, this is using colors and brightnesses for stars and stellar populations. And again, there's other ways to identify stellar streams. I've given talks on galactic archaeology where I only focus on using chemistry, but I thought in this talk I would kind of mix it up a little bit and show that you can use chemistry, but you can also use these sort of easily observed properties of a star. It's not too challenging to measure the brightness of a star, in red light and blue light, white light, and put these color magnitude diagrams together and look for these populations of stars. So I will leave it there. I'm probably close to an hour at this point, but I'm happy to take questions that anybody might have.
Thank you for that presentation, Dr. Sheffield. That was fantastic. If there are questions in the room, all right, let me see if I can change the mic to change it to the room microphones, but I can't see where those are. We do have a question in the chat. Is it possible to know where the constellations were 5,000 or 10,000 years ago?
Yeah, we can do that. We know that there's precession, and where the constellations are today. Like, for example, the North Star is Polaris over time because of precession of the Earth's axis. That takes about 26,000 years to make one full circle. It's kind of like a top spinning. In 13,000 years, Vega will be the North Star. But yeah, we can very predict extremely accurately. If you've ever played with Stellarium, which is an awesome sky program, you can actually move time forward and you can see exactly that happening. So yeah, we are able to know where they were or where they're going also, which I guess was your question.
Great. Question.
Whoops. How does Gaia differentiate transverse motion from proper motion?
Yeah,
Transverse motion from radial motion.
right. Yeah, to get the transverse motion, you actually need the proper motion and the distance. So, right, the radial velocity is a different component altogether. The transverse velocity is actually perpendicular to that. So, if you know that the proper motion is, the motion along, right across the sky as opposed to the radial motions. So if you take the proper motion and you know the distance, you can translate that to the transverse velocity. Did that make sense?
Yeah.
Okay.
Hans.
Yeah.
Yeah, come on up.
Yeah, I would say come on up and ask your question.
Speaking to here.
Right.
Right, just speak.
Just,
Oh,
yeah.
oh, oh, yeah. Yeah, you said that there's a hierarchical merging of smaller galaxies. Why wouldn't you get a ellipsoid galaxy or a spherical galaxy as opposed to a spiral galaxy?
Right, that's a great question, and eventually you will. Maybe I'll go back. Oh no, it was right here. So in the background, again, this is like an artist sketch. I found this on the NASA website, thought it was cool. So this is meant to show the Milky Way merging with another spiral, which is Andromeda. And when spirals come together, eventually they will merge, and through that process of merging, you will get elliptical galaxies. So that's how elliptical galaxies form. They're actually the merger. Because when we saw that cosmological simulation, all these little, dark matter halos in the beginning, they start spinning. So you get these ellipticals. So, we believe that the formation of ellipticals is through the mergers of these spirals. So over time, you will eventually get elliptical.
So we were just lucky. We didn't have, there wasn't enough galaxies to make us elliptical galaxy, or Milky
Well,
Way was formed?
we're not going to be so lucky. So when Andromeda merges with the
Right,
Milky Way,
I understand. I just when the Milky Way was formed, in our present form. So it just seems to me that if this was true, we should have gotten an elliptical galaxy as opposed to a spherical galaxy. If
Yeah,
we
I
had
think-
all of these. So it was just the luck of the draw. Is that basically what you're saying for our particular galaxy?
yeah, I mean, I guess if you had, instead of, like we said, that Gaia Enceladus sausage galaxy merger, that was a big galaxy, but it wasn't the same size as the Milky Way. If we had perhaps a larger merger, I think it just also takes time though. And there's some awesome videos. They're pretty easy to find of the time frame. So like once Andromeda starts merging with the Milky Way, it's still going to be a few billion years after that before they are completely together. So I think it's a combination of, a couple of things. It's the size of the two galaxies that are merging, and that might dictate how much time it takes. So eventually it will happen. But yeah, I think if, what you said is kind of true, we just didn't have a giant merger. But even if we did, we'd probably still be in the process of, everything coming together.
And how do we become a barred spiral as opposed to a normal spiral? What's the process for that? I've never quite understood that.
Yeah, I mean, it's a good question that doesn't have a, terribly direct answer. But my understanding is that bars will naturally form as, galaxies, specifically as stars, orbiting, near the center. As they get older and older, they're going to start, piling up, and their orbits are going to become, less circular. So eventually they're going to kind of elongate. So it's has to do with just sort of the natural aging process, and kind of the decay is not really the right word, but over time the
I think
motions.
okay.
Yeah,
Could I ask another question? Or I don't want to.
We have a few other
Sure.
questions.
Yeah. Go for it.
We'll go to the chat where there's a question around, it doesn't seem to follow a simple bell curve, but the S shape. Do other galaxies seem to follow the same plotting of stars?
When you say the S shape, which parameters are we talking about?
I think the HR diagram is.
Oh, the HR diagram. So yeah, let's go back there. Right. So when you're saying the S shape, you mean the main sequence?
I think he's confusing a statistical distribution of some single factor or some single parameter with what the HR diagram really is, which is an evolutionary diagram.
Mm-hmm.
That's well,
Okay, I think I'm just not quite grasping what the question is.
Okay, I'll talk to the person who asked that question, see if we can get some clarity. In the
Yeah.
meantime, we have another question from Alex Molt. Do we know what the galaxies looked like before they merged, or what our galaxy looked like?
Yeah, I mean, I think that, the best way to try to visualize that is from those simulations, which, so it was going back this way. We just show the screenshots from that. Right, so originally the Milky Way, I mean, it started out as just one of these, you have dark matter, then you have gas that's sort of following these tendrils of dark matter, and then eventually, stuff started, following these tendrils and coming together and clumping. So that was originally what the Milky Way looked like before the merger. So it was smaller, and then you can see it here. So this is, let me see. About 12 billion years ago, it's starting to come together. You still have that main progenitor, but it's starting to pull in more and more galaxies. And then the more galaxies that get pulled in, by the time, so this major merger happens, all those stars get mixed in. And every time another merger happens, the mass of the galaxy increases. And then over time, eventually, instead of this tiny little progenitor of the Milky Way, now we have this much more mature spiral. That is, from time to time, it's still pulling in things, but it's pretty quiescent right now. The galaxy, it seems most of the major merging has already happened.
You have to come up and answer.
So how do the globular clusters participate in the streaming process? Or because of their mass, do they stay relatively intact without stream formation or mergers?
No, they will merge. Like if we look at the figure showing all of these, actually, this is maybe even a better one. Some of these streams are, so PAL 5, if you can see where my cursor is right now, that's actually a globular cluster, and there's others. So globular clusters, they suffer the same, tidal forces that the satellite galaxies do.
Okay.
Yeah, and sometimes depending on the location, actually, it's more of an issue. So with the satellite galaxies, depending on sometimes what their orbital dynamics are when they enter the Milky Way, that can sort of, dictate some differences with the tidal streams. But yeah, globular clusters are just as susceptible to tidal stripping and forming tidal streams as the satellite galaxies are. And I mentioned toward the end that the satellite galaxies, they formed their own globular clusters and they brought those into the Milky Way. So the Milky Way then can even tidally disrupt those globular clusters that came in with these other galaxies. So that was this merger tree here. So you can see that like the sausage, the Gaia Enceladus sausage, that brought in 20 globular clusters that, are associated not with the Milky Way, but with Gaia Enceladus. And then those clusters themselves can get tidally stripped by the Milky Way.
Well, thanks.
Yeah. I can try to go back to the question about the HR diagram.
So we have a few more questions here in the room. Actually, I think we'll take those.
Okay.
So what happened to the black holes in the mergers? Like, are there black holes in these streams?
Well, that's a good one. So the PAL 5 stream actually has, we think, some black holes in it. So you can still get some of those, halos, those dark matter halos that formed really, really early on. Let's go back to our sort of screen grabs from the simulation. So those can, you can still get black hole formation that way. In terms of, like I said, globular clusters, some are thought to have them. And the way the reason we think this, evidence of it, So in PAL 5 is actually a really good example, this globular cluster PAL 5. If we look at its stream, the stream is not just this perfectly smooth, let's see. Let me show a stream. Okay, this is good enough. So if you look at a stream like PAL 5, it's, this looks fairly, the width is pretty continuous across the length, but PAL 5, there's these gaps in the stream where all of a sudden you just have like some stars aren't there. And it's like, what could possibly cause a gap in the stream? And the answer is it could be a black hole, or it could be just, a bare, a dark matter halo that is, again, if it's just a dark matter halo, then it's only gravitationally interacting. We don't actually see it. So that could literally, if it's there, that could push some stars, out of the stream, and that could be creating those gaps. So it's a great question. It's something that's being actively studied right now. But we think that that is the case, and that can explain, again, once we start looking in really, really great detail at these streams, we see these kinks and, other features that could actually be explained if there were black holes, or as I said, on the extreme end, these dark matter halos that are in the clusters that are causing this to happen.
Those would be stellar mass black holes, though.
Yeah,
that
yeah, yep.
Ice from large stars that formed early and then went through their evolution. But what about the possibility that there were supermassive black holes in the early galaxies that merged with the Milky Way?
That's, again, it's a question, it's thought that, the galaxy, galaxies all have, large galaxies have a supermassive black hole at their center. The question is, did they form as these supermassive black holes early in the formation of the universe? Or as the galaxies built up over time, did the black holes get larger and larger? So that's, again, that's another question that is a pretty active area of research. But for sure, the black holes that we were just talking about, the question about the globular clusters, those are the stellar mass.
I think we can take one more question. Everett, I think did you have a question or?
I did, but
Okay.
I'll pass.
Okay.
Oh,
All right. We have one more question.
okay.
Hi, Allyson. First of all, thank you for the talk. That was really fascinating to hear how using HR diagrams and so on, you can sort of trace the evolutionary stages in such a fashion. I guess my question is, you used the word, you talked about these, the attributes you've been using in this study, but you said also you've done chemical studies, you're looking at chemical stuff as well. So if I think about cosmology, not cosmology, but the archaeology of the cosmos, if you will, nuclear burning processes, getting from, I guess, hydrogen through the different elements as far as iron. And then the recycling of those as it becomes dust, after stars come off the evolutionary cycle and you get the dust and you get reforming new stars and so on. Are there any studies that you're doing in terms of looking at the chemical composition to understand some of those cosmological evolutionary processes as opposed to just within a galaxy? I know that's a bit hand wavy, and I am waving my hands here, by the way. I'm just curious, when you use the word chemistry, I'm wondering whether you mean looking at, what chemical elements, are there predominating in certain regions to try and infer how that has evolved on a cosmological scale.
Yeah, I mean, I think, with chemistry, we have to eventually think back to the very first star or stars that ever formed. So, sometimes they're called population 3 stars, but there had to be a first star. And it would have basically just hydrogen and helium to start with, and I guess a little bit of lithium. Then once this massive star explodes, then you're getting these next successive generations of stars. So, when you're tracing the chemical history of the Milky Way, so those first stars formed, 13 billion years ago, but that's also when the globular clusters and the Milky Way started forming. So, we can also look for population 3 stars, in the Milky Way, which would be interesting to find. So it's all kind of, linked because stars, the Milky Way did start forming so long ago, and it did have those old globular clusters. We said some of
Yeah.
those go back to like 13 billion years. Maybe you could have some of those population 3 stars that you could, find in the Milky Way.
Yeah. Okay. Okay.
Yeah, did that answer it? I feel like I went a little.
Yeah. That's what I was just thinking vaguely, but you've clarified it. Yeah. So no, that's very helpful. Is that something that you personally get involved with in terms of research, or is your interest more on the observational, not the spectroscopy or whatever it is you do to infer what the chemical composition is?
Yeah, I mean, I do a lot. Again, I'm an observational astronomer, and I do collect a lot of spectra and derive elements.
Yeah.
I'm typically not looking for those population 3 stars. I'm looking at,
Okay.
let's take a group of stars and look at their chemical abundances. And like right now, I'm working on a study with Sagittarius, and we're looking at the different fingerprints and seeing, because there is some slight variation. Does that tell us something, about star formation that happened in the Sagittarius galaxy? But yeah, if you hear other talks on galactic archaeology, sometimes you'll hear just, how you can use chemical tagging to
Right.
find these galaxies. Yeah, I think it's kind of cool that you can also just use, brightnesses of stars.
Yeah.
And if all
Oh
this
yeah.
stuff,
No, this is really interesting. This I really
yeah,
enjoyed. So,
it's cool. Like the Gaia catalog is public. Like anybody who is listening to this talk could go get Gaia
That's
data
true.
and like search for some color magnitude diagrams.
thanks again. Thank
Yeah,
you.
my pleasure.
All right, I'd like to just give Dr. Sheffield a round of applause. Say thank you very much for taking the time to present to us this evening. This was a wonderful time.
Pleasure.
We'll conclude the meeting here.
Okay. Yeah. And feel free to contact me if anybody has questions. You have my contact info.
Excellent. Thank you very much.
Great.
All right.
All right. Well, happy stargazing tomorrow night.
Yeah.
Maybe I'll see some of you in Rochester for the eclipse. I've got to get on that. What's that?
Thank you.
Okay. All right. Take care, everybody.